The first time my father looked me in the eyes after 15 years, he smiled like he had already won. He stood at the front of my late uncle's conference room adjusting his tie, bragging to the relatives about how he would expand his company once the inheritance was his. He didn't even recognize me at first, until someone whispered my name. He laughed. Grace Well. I guess life didn't work out the way you imagined. I didn't say a word, because I knew something he didn't. I knew the fortune he came here for was already gone, and I knew the envelope in my briefcase would destroy him before the afternoon was over. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened next. The lawyer was reading the final pages of my uncle's will when he suddenly stopped. He stared at his phone, his face turning pale. Then he walked back into the room looking absolutely horrified. That was the moment I realized my uncle had left one final surprise. A surprise that would change everything. People often ask whether I joined the army to escape my past. The truth is much simpler. I joined because one man believed I was worth saving when everyone else had already decided I wasn't. My name is Grace Collins, and I was 16 years old the day my father told me I was no longer his daughter. Looking back now, I can still remember every sound from that afternoon with painful clarity. The old grandfather clock in our hallway ticked louder than usual. Rain tapped against the kitchen windows. My mother's coffee had gone cold beside her untouched plate, but she never noticed. She kept staring at the table as though refusing to look at me would somehow make the entire argument disappear. My father, Richard Collins, stood near the refrigerator with his arms crossed. His face wasn't red with anger anymore. That frightened me even more. He had reached that cold, quiet place where every word came out sharp enough to leave scars. "You had no right," he said. "I had every right," I answered, trying to keep my voice from shaking. He took one slow step toward me. "You embarrassed me." "No," I swallowed. I told the truth. The argument hadn't started because I skipped school or stayed out too late. It hadn't started over boys or grades or teenage rebellion. It started because I found documents hidden in my father's office. College savings statements. My college savings statements. Nearly every dollar my grandparents had set aside for my education was gone. When I confronted him, he brushed it off as a temporary loan. Later, I learned it had been used to cover gambling debts and risky business investments that had collapsed months earlier. I wasn't supposed to know. And I definitely wasn't supposed to tell anyone else. Especially not my Uncle Michael. My father pointed toward the front door. "If you think my brother is your family now, then go." My heart pounded so hard it almost drowned out the rain. "Dad," "Don't call me that." The words hit harder than a slap. "I won't be disrespected in my own house." I looked toward my mother. She finally lifted her eyes. For one impossible second, I thought she might say something. Anything. Instead, she quietly reached for her coffee mug. "I think it's best if you leave for a while." For a while. Funny how those 4 words turned into 15 years. I packed everything I owned into an old blue backpack. A few shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a photo of my grandparents, my high school notebook. $43, that was all. I stood on the front porch waiting for either of them to stop me. Neither did. The front door closed. The deadbolt clicked. I stood in the rain longer than I care to admit. Sometimes people imagine dramatic moments come with music or speeches. They don't. Sometimes they end with nothing more than a locked door. I walked nearly 3 miles before I finally sat down at a bus stop. I wasn't crying anymore. I think my mind simply couldn't process what had happened. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. Grace. I recognized the voice immediately. "Uncle Michael, I've been trying to reach you." I couldn't answer. "Where are you?" I finally whispered the name of the street. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." He arrived in 8. His black pickup pulled alongside the curb, and before I even climbed inside, he wrapped me in the kind of hug that says everything words cannot. He didn't ask whether my father had really thrown me out. He already knew. Apparently, one of the neighbors had called him after hearing the shouting. He drove in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You hungry?" It seemed like such an ordinary question, but after everything that had happened, it nearly broke me. I nodded. We stopped at a little diner I'd visited with him once years earlier. He ordered pancakes. I wasn't hungry enough to eat them. He smiled anyway. "They'll taste better after the second bite." He was right. After dinner, we drove to his house on the edge of town. I'd always loved that place. Unlike my father's large, expensive home that always felt strangely cold, Michael's house felt lived in. Books lined every shelf. Family photographs covered the hallway. There was even an old golden retriever named Murphy waiting at the front door as though he'd been expecting me all day. Michael showed me the guest room. "You can stay here as long as you need. I don't have money." "I didn't ask." "I should probably find a job." "You'll find one." "I don't want to be a burden." He looked directly into my eyes. "Grace." I nodded. "Family isn't about who shares your last name." He rested a hand on my shoulder. "It's about who refuses to let you face the storm alone." That sentence became one of the foundations of my life. Over the next few months, I learned something my father had never understood. Michael wasn't generous because he was wealthy. He was wealthy because people trusted him. He owned one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the Midwest, yet he knew the names of warehouse workers' children. Every Christmas, he handed out bonuses personally. When an employee's wife needed cancer treatment, he quietly paid the hospital bill without telling anyone. Success had made my father arrogant. Success had made my uncle humble. There was a difference. One Saturday morning, while helping him organize supplies for a veterans' charity event, I asked him the question I'd been carrying for months. "Do you hate Dad?" He paused before sealing another cardboard box. "No. After everything, I feel sorry for him." That surprised me. "He thinks money is something you own," Michael said softly. "The truth is, money eventually owns people like him." He looked at me for a long moment. "Promise me something." "What?" "Don't build your future around proving him wrong." I frowned. "Then what should I build it around?" He smiled. "Become someone you're proud to meet in the mirror." Those words stayed with me long after high school graduation. Long after I started rebuilding my confidence. Long after the hurt became something quieter. Nearly 2 years later, Michael watched me finish a community leadership program sponsored by local veterans. On the drive home, he glanced at me with the thoughtful expression he always wore before asking an important question. "Have you ever considered the Army?" I laughed. "Me. You don't quit when life gets hard." He smiled. "You lead without realizing you're leading." I stared through the windshield. For the first time since losing my parents, I saw something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine. Not revenge. Not reconciliation. A future. People like to say that time heals everything. I don't believe that's true. Time doesn't heal, it reveals. It reveals who remembers you when you disappear. It reveals who only loved the version of you that benefited them. Most of all, it reveals whether pain becomes your prison or your teacher. For me, those 15 years became something I never expected. A second life. Uncle Michael never tried to replace my parents. He never told me to forget them, and he certainly never encouraged me to hate them. Whenever I slipped and referred to him as Dad, he would smile, shake his head, and gently correct me. "You've only got one father, Grace," he'd say. "Whether he deserves the title or not is another story." That was who Michael Collins was. He never competed for love. He simply earned it. After graduating from high school, I enrolled in college through an ROTC scholarship. Michael insisted on helping with expenses that weren't covered, but only after making me promise I'd treat every dollar with respect. "This isn't charity," he reminded me one evening while sliding an envelope across the kitchen table. "It's an investment." "In what?" I asked. "In someone who'll make the world better." I laughed, embarrassed. "What if I disappoint you?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "Grace, disappointment comes from people who stop trying." His faith in me became something I carried everywhere. ROTC wasn't easy. Neither was balancing classes, military training, and part-time work. There were mornings when my alarm rang at 4:30 and my body begged me to stay in bed. There were weekends when friends went to football games while I spent hours studying leadership doctrine or preparing for field exercises. Whenever I wanted to quit, I'd remember a rainy afternoon and a 16-year-old girl sitting alone at a bus stop. If she'd survived that day, I could survive one more challenge. Commissioning day arrived faster than I expected. Standing in my dress uniform, raising my right hand to take the oath, I caught sight of Uncle Michael in the audience. He wasn't sitting in the front row. He'd deliberately chosen a seat near the back. That was typical of him. He never wanted attention. But when the ceremony ended and families rushed forward, he was waiting with the same quiet smile I'd known for years. "I'm proud of you, Lieutenant Collins." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were dramatic. Because I'd spent years wondering what it might have felt like to hear my own father say them. Michael seemed to sense what I was thinking. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Don't waste today wishing someone else had shown up." He was right. That became another lesson I never forgot. The Army changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It taught me discipline, certainly. It taught me how to lead soldiers, make decisions under pressure, and remain calm when everyone else was losing theirs. But the greatest lesson had nothing to do with tactics or regulations. It taught me that respect is never demanded. It's earned. During my first deployment overseas, life became measured in routines most civilians never think about. Sunrise briefings, long convoys, endless equipment checks, letters from home that arrived weeks late. Every month without fail a package arrived from Uncle Michael. Sometimes it contained homemade cookies that somehow survived international shipping. Sometimes books, sometimes photographs of Murphy asleep on the living room rug. There was always a handwritten note. Never long, never dramatic. Just enough to remind me that someone back home believed I would come back safely. One card simply read, "Keep taking care of other people, but don't forget to take care of yourself." I kept every single one. Not once during those years did I receive a letter from my parents. No birthday cards, no Christmas messages, no phone calls asking whether I was safe. At first I waited. Then I hoped. Eventually I stopped expecting anything. Oddly enough, that brought peace. Years passed. Promotions came. Assignments changed. The frightened teenager who'd once stood outside a locked front door slowly disappeared. In her place stood an army officer trusted with responsibilities I'd once believed were beyond me. Every time I came home on leave, Michael insisted we spend at least one afternoon fishing at the same quiet lake. Neither of us cared much about catching fish. It was simply where we talked best. One autumn afternoon, while orange leaves drifted across the water, I asked him something that had been bothering me. "Have Mom and Dad ever asked about me?" He reeled in his line slowly before answering. "Once." My heart skipped. "What did they ask?" "They wanted to know whether you'd inherited any part of my company." I stared at the water. Not whether I was okay. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence answered for him. A strange feeling settled over me. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Something quieter. Acceptance. Michael reached into the cooler and handed me a bottle of water. "They've spent years measuring life by what people own." He smiled gently. "You've spent those same years becoming someone people can count on." I still wish things had been different. "I know." He looked toward the far shore. "So do I." By the time I turned 30, Michael's company had become one of the most respected logistics businesses in the region. Newspapers occasionally asked to interview him, but he usually declined. He preferred talking to warehouse employees over television reporters. He always said headlines disappeared. Character didn't. Then everything changed. It started with a phone call I almost ignored. Michael's voice sounded normal. Too normal. "Do you have a few days of leave available?" "I think so. Why?" "I've been running some medical tests." My stomach tightened. "What kind of tests?" He hesitated. "The kind that doctors don't smile about." 3 days later, I was sitting beside him in an oncology office. The doctor explained treatment options carefully, professionally, compassionately. I heard almost none of it. One word echoed through my mind. Cancer. Afterward, we walked through the hospital parking lot in silence. Finally, I asked the question neither of us wanted to say aloud. "Are you scared?" He smiled. "Not of dying." I looked at him. "I'm scared of leaving people I love." That sentence stayed with me far longer than any medical report. I extended my leave and moved into his house temporarily. The routines we'd once enjoyed changed completely. Morning medications, doctor appointments, chemotherapy. Some days he looked almost like himself. Other days, simply walking across the room exhausted him. Yet somehow he never complained. One evening I found him standing on the back porch watching the sunset. The summer air smelled of freshly cut grass. Murphy, now old and gray around the muzzle, lay quietly beside him. "I've been thinking," Michael said. "That's usually dangerous." He laughed softly. "It usually is." We stood there for several minutes before he spoke again. "If I leave before you?" I immediately interrupted. "Don't." "No, listen." His voice remained calm. "Promise me something." I swallowed hard. "Anything. When people disappoint you, don't let disappointment become your identity." I nodded, unable to trust my own voice. "And promise me you'll keep serving." "I will." "Not because of the uniform." He looked directly at me. "Because this country needs leaders who remember what it feels like to have nothing." A few weeks later, he seemed stronger. "We convinced ourselves treatment was working." He joked with nurses, argued with baseball games on television, even planned a fishing trip for the following spring. Then almost overnight, everything changed. The infection came quickly. His body, already weakened, couldn't fight it. I held his hand in the hospital room during his final hours. The machines hummed quietly around us. He opened his eyes one last time. "You did good, Grace." Tears blurred my vision. "No," I whispered. "You did." A faint smile crossed his face. Then peacefully he was gone. The funeral reflected exactly who he had been. No extravagance, no grand displays. Warehouse workers stood beside executives. Veterans stood beside college students whose scholarships he'd quietly funded. People from every walk of life came to say goodbye. The church was overflowing. I realized then that Uncle Michael's greatest achievement had never been building a successful company. It had been building a life that mattered. A week later, just as I was preparing to return to active duty, my phone rang. The caller introduced himself as Michael's attorney. "Colonel," I corrected him gently. "Major, my apologies, Major Collins." His voice became formal. "Mr. Collins requested that the reading of his will take place next Tuesday." "I understand. There's one more thing." "Yes. Every member of the Collins family has been invited." For a moment I forgot how to breathe. 15 years. That was how long it had been since I'd last seen my parents. Now, whether I was ready or not, we were about to meet again. The morning of the will reading arrived with a clear blue sky that felt strangely out of place. Some mornings seem to carry their own weight before your feet ever touch the floor. This was one of them. I stood in front of the mirror inside my hotel room, smoothing the front of my army dress uniform one last time. Every ribbon, every insignia, every crease had been inspected twice. Military habits never really leave you. I wasn't wearing the uniform to impress anyone. I wore it because Uncle Michael had once told me something that stayed with me. Never hide the life you've worked so hard to build just because someone else refused to believe in you. Those words echoed in my mind as I picked up my cover and headed downstairs. The law firm handling Michael's estate occupied the top floor of a historic office building overlooking downtown. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. Everything about the place reflected the same quiet confidence Michael had carried throughout his life. Dark walnut walls, soft leather chairs, large windows overlooking the city he'd helped build. A receptionist greeted me warmly. "Major Collins." "Yes. They're preparing the conference room now." I thanked her and took a seat near the windows. For a few peaceful minutes it was quiet. Then the elevator doors opened. Laughter filled the hallway before I ever saw the faces. My father. Richard Collins looked older than I remembered. His hair had turned mostly gray and deep lines framed his mouth, but his walk hadn't changed. He still carried himself with the confidence of someone convinced the world owed him something. My mother followed beside him. She moved more slowly now. For a brief second our eyes met. Recognition flickered across her face, then uncertainty. She looked away first. Behind them came several cousins, 2 aunts, and a handful of relatives I barely recognized anymore. They spoke excitedly, almost cheerfully, like people arriving for a holiday gathering instead of a funeral. One of my cousins noticed me first. "Grace." The hallway fell unusually quiet. My father turned. He stared at me for several long seconds. I could almost see him searching his memory. Then recognition finally settled across his face. "Well," he let out a short laugh. "I'll be damned." No warmth, no apology, just surprise. "You actually came." "I was invited." He smiled as though we'd run into each other at a grocery store instead of after 15 years of silence. "I heard you joined the army." "I did." "Still in?" "Yes." He glanced briefly at my uniform. "Good." That single word sounded less like approval and more like the end of a conversation. There wasn't even a, "How have you been?" Not one question. Not one acknowledgement of the years we'd lost. Instead, his attention drifted toward the conference room doors. "So," he rubbed his hands together. "I suppose today's going to be interesting." I simply nodded. Interesting wasn't the word I would have chosen. Inside the conference room, name cards had been placed around a long, polished table. Coffee and pastries sat untouched near one wall. Relatives immediately formed small groups talking in hushed voices. It didn't take long before the conversation turned toward Michael's estate. I heard he sold one of his warehouses last year. They say the company's worth hundreds of millions. I wonder who gets the lake house. I heard Richard handled a lot of Michael's early business. None of it surprised me. Money has a way of becoming the loudest voice in a room. My father seemed to enjoy the attention. He leaned comfortably against the table, smiling as relatives asked questions. "I never cared about the money," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Then he added with a grin that contradicted the sentence before it. "But Michael always knew family comes first." Several people nodded. One uncle chuckled. "Well, you're his only brother." "Exactly." Richard shrugged modestly. I told him years ago that one day I'd look after everything. I lowered my eyes toward my coffee. He believed every word he was saying. Or perhaps he had repeated the story so many times that he'd convinced himself it was true. One cousin wandered over to where I stood. It's been forever. It has. You staying in town long? Only a couple of days. He smiled awkwardly. I always wondered what happened after. His voice trailed off. So did I. Before either of us could continue, my father approached. You know, he said casually, Michael was stubborn. I looked at him. He should have forgiven me years ago. The sentence caught me off guard. Not because it contained regret. Because even now, he believed Michael had been the one who owed forgiveness. For what? I asked quietly. Richard frowned. For choosing you over his own brother. I held his gaze. He didn't choose between family. What do you mean? He chose kindness. For the first time that morning, his smile disappeared. You always were dramatic. No. I shook my head. I just remember things differently. He folded his arms. You were 16. I remember enough. His jaw tightened. You embarrassed this family. I exposed the truth. His eyes narrowed. That's your version. It's the only one that happened. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The room around us continued buzzing with conversation, completely unaware of the silence growing between father and daughter. Finally, he leaned closer. I hope you're not here expecting anything. I didn't come for money. He laughed. Everybody says that. I'm not everybody. No. He glanced toward the conference table. My brother built an empire. I know. He always intended to keep it in the family. He already did. Richard frowned. What does that mean? I looked directly into his eyes. I learned who my family was 15 years ago. He stared at me confused. Then he scoffed. Still holding a grudge? I'm holding a memory. Before he could answer, the conference room door opened. A young legal assistant stepped inside. Mr. Foster will be with you shortly. Everyone took their seats. I found mine near the far end of the table. My father deliberately chose the chair closest to the attorney's position. He looked exactly like someone sitting down for a business promotion instead of a final farewell. The conversations gradually faded. A wall clock ticked softly. Outside traffic moved below the windows. No one spoke. 5 minutes passed. Then the attorney entered. Daniel Foster was in his early 60s, impeccably dressed, carrying 2 leather binders and a sealed document box. His expression remained respectful but tired. He offered condolences to everyone before sitting. Thank you all for coming. He adjusted his glasses. As you know, Michael Collins executed the final version of his estate plan 18 months ago. My father nodded confidently. Daniel continued. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that Mr. Collins personally reviewed every provision multiple times. Richard smiled. I'd expect nothing less. The attorney acknowledged him with a polite nod. He opened the first binder. For the next 20 minutes, Michael's generosity unfolded page after page. Several longtime employees received generous retirement trusts. Scholarships were established for children of veterans. A charitable foundation would fund housing programs for teenagers abandoned by their families. A local children's hospital received a substantial endowment. A veterans rehabilitation center received permanent funding. Every announcement revealed another quiet act of generosity none of us had known about. Several relatives exchanged surprised glances. My father, however, had stopped listening. He shifted impatiently in his chair. Finally, he interrupted. I'm sorry. Daniel looked up. Yes? When are we getting to the company? The room became still. Daniel calmly turned another page. We'll arrive there shortly. Another 10 minutes passed. Real estate, private investments, charitable trusts, historic land conservation. Still nothing about Richard? He cleared his throat again. Surely my brother mentioned me? Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then lowered his eyes to the final pages. He did. Richard leaned back with visible satisfaction. I thought so. Daniel slowly removed a single cream-colored envelope from the document box. Across the front, written in Michael's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. For my brother Richard Collins. Daniel placed the envelope gently on the table. Silence spread across the room. Richard blinked. What's this? Your inheritance. His confident smile faltered. Where's everything else? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he folded his hands. Mr. Collins. His voice remained calm. According to your brother's final will. He paused just long enough for every eye in the room to settle on him. This letter is the only item he left directly to you. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. For the first time that morning, My father's smile disappeared completely. For several long seconds, no one spoke. My father kept staring at the cream-colored envelope as though the rest of the inheritance might suddenly materialize if he waited long enough. His fingers hovered over it but never touched it. Finally, he let out a dry laugh. "This is a joke." No one answered. He looked around the room searching for anyone to laugh with him. Instead, he found only puzzled faces. He turned back to Daniel Foster. "So, where are the rest of the documents?" Daniel remained perfectly composed. "Those are the documents, Mr. Collins. The company. The company is addressed in the estate plan. And," Daniel folded his hands, "it is no longer part of your brother's estate." The words landed with the weight of a hammer. My father blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what I said." Richard's face reddened. "That's impossible." His voice rose another octave. "My brother owned Collins National Logistics." "He did." "He built it over 40 years." "Yes." "So where is it?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward me. It lasted only a second. But my father noticed. His head snapped in my direction. "You." His finger pointed straight across the table. "You've done something." Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. My mother whispered his name. "Richard?" "No." He ignored her completely. "She's manipulated him for years." I remained seated. My heartbeat had quickened, but years in uniform had taught me something invaluable. When everyone else loses control, you don't. "You don't believe that?" I said quietly. "I absolutely do. You haven't even heard the rest." "I don't need to." His voice echoed against the conference room walls. My brother would have never cut me out. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You cut me out." His expression hardened. "That's different." "No, it isn't." A painful silence followed. I could almost hear Uncle Michael's voice in my memory. "Never argue with anger. Anger only listens to itself." So I stopped speaking. Richard mistook my silence for weakness. He stood so abruptly that his chair rolled backward several feet. "I'm contesting this." Daniel looked up. "That is your legal right. I'll have this entire will thrown out. You're entitled to seek legal counsel." My brother wasn't thinking clearly. Daniel calmly opened another folder. His physicians documented that he was fully competent. There had to be pressure. There is no evidence of undue influence. He would have never done this. He spent 18 months reviewing every provision. Richard slammed both hands onto the polished conference table. "He loved this family," Daniel answered gently. "He did." "Then where's the inheritance?" The attorney met his eyes. "Perhaps you're asking the wrong question." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means Mr. Collins viewed inheritance differently than most people." My father laughed bitterly. "Don't give me philosophy." "I won't." Daniel closed the folder. "I'll give you facts." Before he could continue, Richard rounded the table toward me. His footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. He stopped only a few feet away. "You've been planning this." "I didn't." "You filled his head with lies." "I never had to." "You stole my family." The accusation hung in the air. For the first time all morning I stood. Not aggressively, simply because I wanted us to be eye level. I was 16. He didn't respond. "You told me to leave." Silence. "You locked the door." Still nothing. "I didn't steal anyone." My voice stayed remarkably steady. "I just accepted the only home that was offered." Several relatives lowered their eyes. An older aunt quietly wiped away a tear. My father opened his mouth to argue. Nothing came out. Instead, he looked toward Daniel again. "Read the rest." Daniel nodded. "There is one statement Mr. Collins instructed me to read aloud before opening the final documents." He unfolded a single sheet. "If my brother Richard is present today," Daniel began, "I imagine he's wondering where the fortune went." A few nervous glances passed around the room. Daniel continued, "If that's what brought him here, then perhaps this is the first honest conversation we've had in many years." My father's jaw tightened. "Richard," Daniel read, "wealth was never the measure of a family. Character was. Somewhere along the way you confused the two." "Enough." Richard held up a hand. "I'm done listening to this." Daniel lowered the page. "There is still more." "I don't care." "I believe your brother hoped you would." Richard started toward the conference room door. Halfway there he stopped. Turned around. "If the company isn't in the estate." His voice narrowed. "Where is it?" That question finally brought the room back into complete silence. Daniel inhaled slowly. "I'll answer that." He reached for another leather portfolio. The company ceased to exist in its original form almost 10 years ago. Several relatives looked confused. What one cousin whispered. Daniel continued. Mr. Collins sold controlling ownership through a structured acquisition. Richard stared at him. No. The transaction occurred 9 years and 8 months ago. No. It was entirely confidential. No. His shout echoed through the room. He would have told me. Daniel looked at him sadly. He chose not to. My father seemed unable to process what he was hearing. You expect me to believe he sold everything. He spread his arms helplessly. And nobody knew. Very few people did. Where did the money go? Daniel opened another document. Large charitable endowments. He turned a page. Veterans housing initiatives. Another page. Educational trusts. Another. Medical research. Then another. Emergency funds for abandoned teenagers. I swallowed hard. That last one sounded painfully familiar. Richard shook his head in disbelief. That's not possible. It is. What happened to the rest? Daniel hesitated. There is one final instruction. He reached beneath the conference table and removed a small, locked document case. I recognized it immediately. I'd seen it once before in Michael's home office years earlier. He had smiled when I asked about it. That's for another day. Daniel unlocked the brass clasps. Inside rested a sealed envelope, a flash drive, and a handwritten note. The attorney looked around the room. Mr. Collins instructed that these items be opened only after the will had been completed. Richard folded his arms. Fine. Daniel inserted the flash drive into the conference room computer. The large monitor at the end of the room flickered to life. A frozen image appeared. Uncle Michael. He sat behind the familiar desk in his home office wearing a navy sweater, reading glasses resting low on his nose. Healthy. Relaxed. Alive. My throat tightened instantly. Daniel pressed play. Michael smiled warmly. If you're watching this, his familiar voice filled the room. Then I suppose I finally lost my argument with time. A few quiet chuckles broke the tension. Even I smiled through the ache in my chest. He continued. Grace. My heart skipped. Thank you for keeping your promise. I lowered my eyes. He remembered. Then Michael looked directly into the camera. Richard. The warmth disappeared from his face. If you've come today hoping to inherit my fortune... He paused. Then you've misunderstood me for decades. My father froze. I spent my life building a business, Michael continued calmly. But I spent even longer building something far more important. The video cut briefly to photographs. Scholarship recipients, veterans, employees, children, families, lives changed. I sold the company years ago because I realized businesses aren't legacies. He smiled softly. People are. Every person in the room watched without speaking. Then came the sentence none of us expected. I have entrusted everything that remained under my personal control. He looked directly into the camera again, to the one person who never asked me for a single dollar. My father slowly turned toward me. His face had gone completely pale. Before Daniel could say another word, his cell phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. His expression changed instantly. The color drained from his face. He answered quietly, listened for less than 30 seconds, then ended the call. Every eye in the room followed him. Daniel looked up slowly. His voice was barely above a whisper. I'm terribly sorry. He swallowed. There's been another development. The room became absolutely still. He looked at me. Then, at the sealed envelope still lying inside the document case. It appears... He paused, visibly shaken. Mr. Collins left behind one final set of instructions. And judging by the expression on Daniel Foster's face, even he had never expected to see them. No one spoke. The silence inside that conference room felt different now. It no longer belonged to shock alone. It carried expectation, uncertainty, and something else I couldn't quite name. Daniel Foster rested one hand on the sealed envelope still lying inside the document case. I apologize, he said quietly. I believed the video contained Mr. Collins' final instructions. He looked down again. It didn't. My father let out an impatient breath. What now? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he broke the seal on the envelope with remarkable care, as though he understood he was opening something far more valuable than another legal document. Inside was a handwritten letter. There was also a single notarized instruction sheet. Daniel read it silently. Then he closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he looked up again, his voice had softened. This letter was written less than 3 weeks before Mr. Collins passed away. He glanced toward me. and he specifically instructed that it be read only after the video. My father folded his arms. Then read it. Daniel unfolded the pages. To everyone I love, he began. If you're hearing these words, then my time is over and yours continues. That means you still have something I no longer do, the chance to choose what kind of family you'll become. The room remained perfectly still. Richard, before I say anything else, I want you to know I never stopped loving you. My father's eyes flickered. You were my older brother long before you became a disappointed man. I remember the boy who taught me to ride a bicycle. I remember the young father who couldn't stop talking about his little girl. I have spent years hoping that version of you would come home. For the first time that day, my father's shoulders dropped. Daniel continued. But love does not require me to reward the choices that destroyed our family. No one moved. You lost Grace long before you lost any chance of inheriting my estate. I heard someone quietly inhale across the room. The day you asked your 16-year-old daughter to leave you made the most expensive decision of your life. Not because of money, because you walked away from someone extraordinary before she even knew she could become extraordinary. Tears blurred my vision. I blinked them away. Daniel paused just long enough to steady his own voice before reading again. You believed I gave everything to Grace. That isn't true. I gave Grace something years ago. I gave her a safe place to become herself. No one in the room seemed capable of looking anywhere except the letter. Everything else she earned on her own. My father slowly lowered himself into his chair. For the first time in my life. He looked small. Daniel reached the final page. Richard, inside the envelope addressed to you is the only inheritance I could honestly leave. He nodded toward the cream-colored envelope that had remained untouched since the beginning of the meeting. My father stared at it. His hands trembled slightly as he finally picked it up. No one hurried him. He opened it carefully. Inside was only a single folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. His lips parted. He read it again. Finally, almost in a whisper, he spoke the words aloud. You lost your daughter long before you lost my fortune. The room fell silent once more. Nothing followed. No accusations. No legal arguments. No hidden bank accounts. Just one sentence. And somehow it carried more weight than hundreds of millions of dollars ever could. My father remained frozen, staring at the paper as though it had become a mirror. For several long moments, no one interrupted him. Then something happened that I never thought I would see. He cried. Not dramatically. Not loudly. A single tear landed on the letter. Then another. My mother reached for his arm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he covered his face with one hand. I threw her away. His voice barely existed. I actually threw my daughter away. No one answered him. There wasn't anything left to say. After a while, Daniel folded the remaining estate papers. There is one final administrative matter. Everyone looked up. The charitable foundation Mr. Collins established is fully operational. He turned toward me. Major Collins, under the terms of the trust, you will serve as its chair. I nodded quietly. The foundation will continue funding scholarships for abandoned teenagers, housing programs for veterans, and emergency assistance for young people who've been left without family support. A faint smile found its way onto my face. It was exactly what Uncle Michael would have wanted. Daniel closed the final binder. That concludes the estate proceedings. One by one, relatives quietly gathered their belongings. No one talked about money anymore. No one asked about the company. The conversation had changed. Outside the conference room windows, the afternoon sun stretched across the city. Life continued. People hurried along sidewalks. Cars moved through intersections. The world had no idea that an entire family had just been changed forever. As I reached for my briefcase, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. My father stood only a few feet away. He looked older than he had that morning. Not because of time. Because regret has a way of aging people all at once. I don't deserve forgiveness. His voice cracked. No, I answered honestly. You don't. He lowered his eyes. I thought money would fix everything. It never could. I kept telling myself you'd come back. I looked at him for a long moment. I did. His shoulders slumped. You did. I came back because Uncle Michael asked me to. Another painful silence settled between us. Finally, he looked up. Is there any chance? He couldn't finish the sentence. I knew what he wanted to ask. Whether we could become father and daughter again. Whether 15 years could somehow be erased. Whether one apology could rebuild what had been abandoned. I took a slow breath. I don't know what the future looks like, he nodded. I understand. But I hope you become the man Uncle Michael spent years believing you could still become." His eyes filled again. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying." For the first time since I was 16, he didn't ask me for anything. Not money, not forgiveness, not another chance. Only the opportunity to become a better man. That mattered. As I walked toward the elevator, my mother quietly caught up with me. "I'm sorry." 2 simple words, 15 years late, but genuine. I squeezed her hand gently. "I know." The elevator doors closed. As they descended, I caught my reflection in the polished steel. I wasn't looking at the frightened girl standing in the rain with a backpack anymore. I was looking at an army officer, a leader, a woman who had survived rejection without allowing it to define her. Uncle Michael hadn't left me an empire. He'd left me something infinitely greater. He taught me that family is built by loyalty, not blood. That character outlives wealth. That kindness compounds more reliably than money ever will. In the years that followed, the foundation helped thousands of young people who had nowhere else to turn. Every scholarship awarded, every veteran housed, every frightened teenager given a second chance, reminded me of one rainy afternoon when a lonely 16-year-old girl answered a phone call from the only adult who refused to give up on her. Whenever someone thanked me for the foundation's work, I always smiled and told them the truth. This didn't begin with me. It began with one man who opened his front door. And every time I said those words, I pictured Uncle Michael standing on that porch with the same calm smile he had worn all those years ago. He had once told me that the greatest inheritance wasn't something you kept. It was something you passed on. Now I finally understood what he meant. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear what you think. Have you ever met someone who changed your life simply by believing in you when no one else did? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. Stories like this remind us that family isn't always the one we're born into. Sometimes it's the one we build through love, loyalty, and grace. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey.